Good morning. Today we're going to talk about the Adam and Eve story. Hopefully this is something you haven't seen before. This book was published in 1965 and immediately banned, and it wasn't allowed to be released until June 24th, 2013. It is still a sanitized copy, but you'll get the gist. Basically, you'll view the Adam and Eve story in a way that you haven't thought of it before. We have to remember that the Adam and Eve story was originally translated from Naga glyphs, and translations were often done very literally, but in later times, as the glyphs were understood more and what the symbology meant, the way that the creation story was translated most likely is not how it happened. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip down to where it starts. Okay, so here are the contents, and you can look at that. We're going to read the next cataclysm, and we're going to read Genesis. But the rest of it, I'm not going to read. Okay, so the next cataclysm, this is describing what is due to occur here, now, soon. Like Noah's 6,500 years ago, and like Adam and Eve's 11,500 years ago, this too will come to pass. With a rumble so low as to be inaudible, growing, throbbing, then fuming into a thundering roar, the earthquake starts. Only it's not like any earthquake in recorded history. In California, the mountains shake like ferns in a breeze. The mighty Pacific rears back and piles up into a mountain of water more than 2 miles high. Then it starts its race eastward. With the force of 1,000 armies, the wind attacks, ripping, shredding, everything in its supersonic bombardment. The unbelievable mountain of the Pacific seawater follows the wind eastward, burying Los Angeles and San Francisco as if they were but grains of sand. Nothing, but nothing, stops the relentless, overwhelming onslaught of wind and ocean. Across the continent, the 1,000-mile-per-hour wind wreaks its unholy vengeance everywhere, mercilessly, unceasingly. Every living thing is ripped into shreds while being blown across the countryside, and the earthquake leaves no place untouched. In many places, the Earth's molten sublayer breaks through and spreads a sea of white-hot liquid fire to add to the Holocaust. Within 3 hours, the fantastic wall of water moves across the continent, burying the wind-ravaged land under 2 miles of seething water coast to coast. In a fraction of a day, all vestiges of civilization are gone, and the great cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, New York, are nothing but legends. Barely a stone is left where millions walked just a few hours before. A few lucky ones who managed to find shelter from the screaming wind on the lee side of Pikes Peak watched the sea of molten fire break through the quaking valleys below. The raging waters follow, piling higher and higher, steaming over the molten earth fire and rising almost to their feet. Only great mountains such as this can withstand the cataclysmic onslaught. North America is not alone in her death throes. Central America suffers the same kind of odd wind, earth fire, and inundation. South America finds the Andes not high enough to stop the cataclysmic violence pounded out by nature in her berserk rage. In less than a day, Ecuador, Peru, and western Brazil are shaken madly by the devastating earthquake, burned by molten earth fire, buried under cubic miles of torrential Pacific seas, and then turned into a frozen hell. Everything freezes. Man, beast, plant, and mud are all rock hard in less than 4 hours. This may be how our mud fossils came about. And they're discussing the plasma storm here. Europe cannot escape the onslaught. The raging Atlantic piles higher and higher upon itself, following the screeching wind eastward. The Alps, Pyrenees, Urals, and Scandinavian mountains are shaken and heaved even higher before the wall of water strikes. Western Africa and the sands of the Sahara vanish in nature's wrath, under savage attack by wind and ocean. The area bound by the Congo, South Africa, and Kenya suffers only severe earthquakes and winds, no inundation. Survivals there marvel at the sun, standing still in the sky for nearly half a day. Eastern Siberia and the Orient suffer a strange fate indeed, as though a giant subterranean Sith sweeps away the Earth's foundations, accompanied by the wind in its screaming symphony of supersonic death and destruction. As the Arctic Basin leaves its polar home, Eastern Siberia, Manchuria, China, and Burma are subjected to the same annihilation as South America. Wind, earth fire, inundation, and freezing. Jungle animals are shredded to ribbons by the wind, piled into mountains of flesh and bone, and buried under avalanches of seawater and mud. Then comes the terrible, paralyzing cold. Not man, nor beast, nor plant, nor earth is left unfrozen in the entire eastern Asian continent, most of which remains below sea level. East of the Urals in western Siberia, a few lucky people survived the fantastic winds and quakes. Antarctica and Greenland, with their ice caps, now rotate around the Earth in the torrid zone, and the fury of winds and inundation marches on for 6 days and nights. During the 6th day, the oceans start to settle in their new homes, running off the high grounds. On the 7th day, the horrendous rampage is over. The Arctic Ice Age is ended, and a new Stone Age begins. The oceans, the great homogenizers, have laid down another deep layer of mud over the existing strata in the Great Plains, as exposed in the Grand Canyon, Painted Desert, and Badlands. The Bay of Bengal Basin, just east of India, is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean, just west of Peru, is at the South Pole. Greenland and Antarctica, now rotating equatorially in the torrid zone, find their ice caps dissolving madly in the tropical heat. Massive walls of water and ice surge toward the oceans, taking everything from mountains to plains in gushing, heaving paths, creating immense seasonal moraines. In less than 25 years, the ice caps are gone, and the oceans around the world rise over 200 feet with the newfound water. The torrid zone will be shrouded in a fog for generations from the enormous amounts of moisture poured into the atmosphere by the melting ice caps. New ice caps begin to form in the new polar areas. Greenland and Antarctica emerge with verdant tropical foliage. Australia is the new unexplored continent in the North Temperate Zone, with only a few handfuls of survivors populating its vastness. New York lies at the bottom of the Atlantic, shattered, melted by earth fire, and covered by unbelievable amounts of mud. Of San Francisco and Los Angeles, not a trace is left. Egypt emerges from its Mediterranean inundation, new and higher, still the land of the ages. The commonplace of our time becomes the mysterious Baalbek of the new era. A new era. Yes, the cataclysm has done its work well. The greatest population regulator of all does once more for man what he refuses to do for himself, and drives the pitiful few who survive into a new Stone Age. Once more, the Earth has shifted its 60-mile thick shell, with the poles moving almost to the equator in a fraction of a day. Again, the atmosphere and oceans, refusing to change direction with the Earth's shell, have wiped out almost all life. After this tumble, we join Noah, Adam and Eve, Atlantis, Mu, and Olympus, and Jesus joins Osiris, Taroa, Zeus, and Vishnu. Now, I'm going to skip to page 26. You can read through the rest of this. I will link the document. But right here on number 6, now Ezra was in charge of rewriting all Hebrew history and law. So he reinterpreted everything. So this is discussion of the Naga glyphs. Okay. So I'm going to start in the second paragraph here. Our knowledge of Naga glyphs tells us that the tree of life symbolized a mother continent, a parent civilization lasting thousands of years longer than ours of today. An unadorned serpent represented water, or the ocean. A serpent entwined about a tree signified that the mother continent was surrounded by water. Genesis 3:15 actually describes Eve's heel on the serpent's head, showing her victory over the oceans. Cherubims, which were not pretty, plump babies, but hybrid man and beast, were the glyphs for legs or foundations or underpinnings. Instead of being placed in the Garden of Eden, one was taken away, and a Naga or Maya reading of the Egyptian Book of the Dead shows that cherubims of the north, east, south, and west were taken away, meaning that the foundations of the mother continent in all directions were removed or destroyed. The flaming sword was the symbol of fire and earthquake. The fire signified what all legends of these cataclysms call earth fire, which is the molten layer below the Earth's 60-mile thick shell, breaking through to the surface during a tumble, a literal hell. It is most probably the origin of man's concept of hell, as a matter of fact. Now back to the tree. Fruit growing on that tree symbolized the original mankind which settled the mother continent ages before Adam and Eve. Their eating of the fruit tells us that they were descended from the original mankind of the continent. Eve eating first signifies that she was the generation after Adam, making her his daughter. The glyph of the creation is even more revealing. There are three figures represented in this picture. The top figure is the face of a sleeping or dead person. There were no separate symbols for death or sleep in Naga. The middle figure is shown as a male, and the bottom figure a female, who is represented as the mother of all mankind. In addition, there are curved lines from the sleeping or dead person and the male middle figure to the bottom female figure. The glyph has been interpreted literally to mean that the middle figure, a male, was put to sleep, shown by the top figure, and a rib or ribs removed from him, the ribs being curved lines, and fashioned into the bottom figure, the female mother of all mankind. This fits beautifully with the story of Eve's creation. Adam, therefore, being both the male figure and the top figure, a sleeping or dead person. There is a slight hitch to this story, however. The top figure, whether sleeping or dead, is depicted as female. How could it be Adam asleep, awake, dead, or alive? Moreover, in Naga, the curved lines denote parentage rather than ribs. So more reasonably, it appears that the top figure is a dead female whose offspring by the male middle figure, Adam, was the bottom female figure, Eve, the mother of the Hebrews. So, in essence, the story as read from the glyphs would be that Adam and Eve, who lived in the Garden of Eden in the Mother Continent, were descended from the original mankind of that land, which incidentally was surrounded entirely by water. Eve was Adam's daughter, and he was a widower. They realized that in order to survive, they had to leave and never try to return, for the motherland was to be destroyed by a cataclysmic inundation. They left, and afterward the continent was subjected to a fiery earthquake, during which it lost its foundations and sank beneath the ocean, which forever afterward walked over the sunken continent. So let's review the event 2 cataclysms ago, and then apply our knowledge toward a representative translation interpretation of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. It may be the most accurate reading of a story written 11,500 years ago. And that's what I'm going to skip to now, is the translation of Genesis as done directly from the Naga texts to English, skipping Greek and Hebrew. Okay, so we're going to start reading this. Well, okay, there's Genesis and then this Regenesis. Both are in the Bible. But we're going to read a translation interpretation of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 from a reconstruction of what the Naga must have been to give us the chapters as we have had them in English, then retranslating directly from Naga to English, bypassing Greek and Hebrew. Okay, let's just read this and see what we think. The book of Genesis, chapters 1, 2, and 3. In the beginning, the universe was created in God's great design. Included was our sun and our planet Earth. And during one of the many cataclysms that occurred during the Earth's history, this one being 11,500 years ago, the Earth's lands were all inundated with raging waters and ravaged by horrendous winds, and the oceans were all dark with muddiness, and the ill wind thundered over the troubled waters also. And as the storms abated, sunlight came back to the face of the earth as God intended. And while the Holocaust was abating, once more darkness and sunlight were reestablished and distinguishable, and it was good. And sunlight was once again daytime, and darkness again nighttime, in accordance with God's design, and evening and morning made one day. Again, God's original design was that there be a sky between the clouds and the oceans, and in accordance with God's design, the heavens were reestablished, in that the sky again stood between the clouds and the oceans as the onslaught of the great storms abated. And God's heavens were indeed reestablished, and that evening and morning were the beginning of the second day. And God's design was that the lands would not be entirely covered by the oceans, as they were immediately followed a cataclysm. So the disrupted oceans, now settling, drained off the higher lands. And in accordance with God's design, the dry land was earth and the waters ocean, and once again it was reestablished and good. And since God's design was that the earth should bring forth grass and herbs yielding their seed, and the fruit yielding fruit containing its seed, and the earth was again reestablished. Therefore the earth, being reestablished, brought forth grass and herbs yielding their seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit containing its seed, and it was good as God intended. And the evening and the morning were the start of the third day. In accordance with God's design, there were normally lights in the heavens, which served to indicate months, seasons, days, and years. Also, they served to furnish light on the earth as God intended. And as the great fog lifted, the clouds broke, the sun and moon reappeared, and also the stars. And once again, as God intended, they shone from the heavens. And the sun and moon again were able to divide light and darkness, which was good. And the evening and the morning were the start of the fourth day. And it was God's will that some of every creature, living and bird flying, should survive the cataclysmic inundation. Surviving then were great whales and every living creature of the sea, every kind of winged fowl, and it was as God intended and good. And they were blessed with God's original design to be fruitful and reproduce and replenish the oceans with sea life and the air with fowl. And the evening and the morning were the start of the fifth day. And it was God's will that some of every creature, cattle, and creeping thing, and beast of earth should survive the cataclysmic inundation. Surviving then were the beasts, the cattle, and everything that creeps on the earth, and it was as God intended and good. And in accordance with God's design, man, who was created in the image God intended, also was to survive and have dominion over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So it was God's design that man, who was created in the image God intended, both male and female, would survive the cataclysmic inundation. And they were blessed with God's original design to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And note the word replenish. The actual Bible does say that, which is weird choice of word. And control it, and have dominion over fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And God's design was that man, being given every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to man it should be for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth wherein there is life, God's design was that green herbs shall serve for food, and it was as God intended. And everything which survived was as God had originally created, and still was in God's design, and was good. And the evening and the morning were the beginning of the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were reestablished, all the host of them. And on the seventh day the recovery from the Holocaust and flood were complete, and the seventh day brought rest from the fight for survival against the Holocaust and its after effects. The seventh day brought God's blessed peace, as the Holocaust had abated, leaving those of his creation who survived. These are the same regenerations of the heavens and of the earth as they were reestablished after the tumble previous to the one of this story, when the Lord God reestablished the earth and the heavens. And every plant of the field before that cataclysm was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not brought rain upon the earth in this region, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there was this cataclysm, and great inundations arose over the earth. And it was God's will that man should rise up from the earth and keep the breath of life and remain a living soul. This is his story. And it was God's will after a cataclysm that a continent eastward be established, and there in Eden lived the man of this story. And from this land grew other civilizations on other lands, with the motherland in the midst of all, being the seat of wisdom, of all knowledge, both good and evil. And the inundation destroyed Eden and left only its 4 offspring lands. Now the 4 offspring lands I find interesting. Around the North Pole, there are always 4 lands. Okay, I'm going to skip down here. I'm going to skip down to 17. And God's design was that man was warned, although the motherland was the source of all knowledge, both good and evil, if he stay therein, surely he would die. And it was God's design that the man should not be alone, therefore a mate should be his. And since God had originally created every beast of the field and fowl of the air, and in his time Adam had named each one, and Adam gave names to all the cattle and to the fowl of the air and to every beast of the field, but for Adam there was no mate, for Adam's mate had died after giving birth to the child of Adam. And the child of the man was a female made in the image God intended. And Adam said, "This child is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She grew into womanhood." Therefore the man was both father and mother to her, and she abode with him as they were one flesh. And the climate there was warm, requiring little or no clothing. Now at the time of the beginning of this story, the oceans were in their normal state of quietness, and it was known to the woman of this story that she was not descended from any of the peoples of the lands which sprang from the mother continent. And God's design was that the woman would learn that the people of the offspring lands would live on, but the people of the motherland from whom she had descended would all surely die. For God's design was that from the day she was born, she was descended from the original mankind of the motherland, and was destined to know all, to discern both good and evil. And the woman, being of the motherland and being wise and good, knew that both she and her father were descended from the original mankind of the motherland. And they were both wise and had lived a good life. And it was that time of the year when some clothing was needed for warmth. And in the cool of those days, when they were wondering to which of the offspring lands they should go, God's presence was felt strongly by them. Adam felt God's call and said, I have heard God's warning since the summer and have feared, for I know not where to find refuge. And God's warning had come to him in the summer as a warning to leave the land of his ancestors. And the man said, the woman who is my daughter and descended of my ancestors gave me this knowledge. And asked her, what gift of knowledge has God given you? And the woman said, I am of your ancestors and inherit their wisdom. And the coming inundations of the oceans has been made known to me. And God's design was that the oceans would so inundate the lands and drown all the cattle and all the beasts of field and bury all dust. And God thus has given me victory over the oceans, such that the seed of future generations is in you and me, for that the oceans will drown all the others. And God's design was that although the inundation would greatly multiply her sorrows, she would even bring forth children, as her love would be for her husband and his for her. And unto Adam it was God's will that he heed the words of his daughter, and God's warning that they be descendants of the original mankind of the motherland, that they should leave it, as it was destined for destruction, and were they to stay, surely they would regret it. And where Adam was to go, the land would be difficult to farm, with thorns and thistles abounding, and even so the herb of the field was to be their food. By his own toil and sweat, he was destined to fight the fight for survival after the inundation, even to the end of his days, when he would return to Mother Earth. As it was earth man came from, and unto earth he shall return. And after the inundation, Adam therefore made the woman his wife, and called her Eve, as she was to be the mother of all living from the motherland. And again, after the inundation, as they were in a colder climate, it was God's design as part of their survival that they make coats of skins and be clothed. And it was God's design that Adam should take with him the knowledge of good and evil from the motherland as he put forth and left in order to live. Therefore, in accordance with God's will, he left the Garden of Eden to survive and live from the soil where he was to go. So the man left, and the Garden of Eden was subjected to a cataclysm of earthquake and fire, and the motherland lost its foundations and sank beneath the oceans. Okay, so that's the conclusion that I'm going to read. I encourage you to check this out for yourself. It's a 57-page document. It is a good read, the whole thing. I'm not saying that you believe it. I'm just saying that you consider it. Have a great day.